Let me introduce today's speaker and собеседник, Dominik Gutmeyr of University of Graz. Graz will speak, whose paper is titled Camera Caucasica, Networks of Photographic Practices in the Transimperial Caucasus. And Dominik's собеседник is Naomi Caffee of Reed College. Please, Dominik, it's you.
Okay, I was muted as well, sorry. Thank you very much for the kind introduction to Ilya. I would like to start by thanking each and everyone here, the organizers of 19V for giving me the opportunity to speak today, to present part of my research, to Sasha for the technical support, to Naomi for agreeing to be today's собеседник, and special thanks to Sarah Dickinson for inviting me to this wonderful platform and for thinking of me when putting together the seminar series for this year, for this fall. So let me first tell you what this paper is, because it is not a polished book talk. It is really work in progress, which might mean that we'll end up with more questions than answers, but these questions will then again help me to develop it a bit further. I'll try to give a broader overview of my project first, and then break it down a bit, speaking about a few elements that seem important to understand 19th century photography in the region. And I will do so against the backdrop of industrializing Baku at the turn of the century. My working hypothesis right now is that photography in the Caucasus is a zone of transcultural communication, which extends also to non-human agency, based on the idea that that the camera was and is a great equalizer, with equipment and processes used being essentially the same throughout the 19th century, regardless of the geographic location rather than the development of the technology per se. And I therefore look to map these patterns of entanglements between local and global agency in early photography, not understanding global and local as binaries, but really as amalgamations. Yeah. So, yeah, I do have some slides as well. Let's take it from the start here. Well, I remember that the opening discussion here on 19V addressed the question whether what the 19th century actually is, where it begins, and whether the answers to that are different for different disciplines. And if one were to join the quest for the origins of photography, it would globally seem probably take you to Paris and to Daguerre in 1839. For the Caucasus region, it was in the early 1840s when a civil servant by the name of Sergei Levitsky joined the German chemist Karl Julius Fritzsche, an associate of the Imperial Academy of Sciences, on an expedition that aimed to investigate mineral springs in the Russian Empire's southern borderlands. At that time, Levitsky was a civil servant. He got to know the camera through Fritzsche, but he was assigned to take a few photographs of Caucasus vistas around Pidigorsk, around Kislovodsk, thereby producing the first series of photographs of the region, and also the first prominent series of Russian landscape photography. These images would then circulate in Paris, where the daguerreotypes were awarded a gold medal at the 1849 exposition of the Second Republic, which was a first for any photograph. And Levitsky became celebrated for his work both abroad and at home. He became known as something like the founding father of Russian photography, renowned mostly for his later portrait photography. And I think we've had the photo here on the bottom of the slide in one of the presentations in the previous weeks. Well, you've surely come across a lot of photos by Levitsky. Now, a solely artistic understanding of photographic history would now attribute on the aesthetic quality of an early masterpiece, which would have been the work of an individual genius who had recognized the directorial potential of the rugged peaks in the imperial borderlands, as well as his mastery of the new art of photography. But Levitsky's mountain vistas would not have come into being, nor would they have sparked a lot of interest if it weren't for a web of actors within a network of political, cultural, economic relations So if you think of Alexander Pushkin and his discovery of the Caucasus, in a sense that he had, and I'm quoting here, Susan Leighton, securely fixed the territory and the readership's cultural horizon. Levitsky's photographs, they would not have been able to automatically build on rich cultural capital. And if it weren't for the active exchange between Russian and West European pioneers, Levitsky would not have used one of Russian daguerreotypist Alexei Grekov's cameras with one of Charles Chevalier's combined glass lenses, an available option which eventually made it interesting for Chevalier to exhibit images of Russian landscapes at an industrial exposition in France. So if the Russian government had not been interested in underscoring the future potential of the southern borderlands it was about to conquer, it would also hardly have assigned a photographer to the task of investigating mineral springs. So several things come together here in these early landscape photos. It is the poetic conceptualization of the Caucasus as a new Parnassus. It is international technological innovation. It is imperialist expansionism. It is governmental support for topographic documentation in combination with an understanding of photography being a craft rather than an art. And all these play together and made Levitsky release the shutter vis-a-vis the mountain range. And this also resulted in a wide circulation of these images and some acclaim of these images. And some might even consider the region now a cradle of Russian photography, also a quote here. So it is the interplay of all these factors, that the manifold processes of circulation and reciprocal negotiation within this intercultural context zone that I'm interested in. And of course, photography, it relates to social and cultural norms, which can be different from place to place. So the question of global networks, of knowledge production, local adaptations of photographic practices, they are in my focus. Understanding, however, the local as part of the global and not as some opposite here. So, well, research in archives and libraries has taken me quite far now, from Moscow to Pyatigorsk, from Biella in Italy to Baku, from Stockholm to Tbilisi. All this has allowed me to establish, can I move that? Yeah. A database with over 800 photographers who constitute the central nodes in the networks under investigation. I have complemented this archival trail with the many digitized online collections and private initiatives. And I really followed a minimal definition of a Caucasus photography here based on what I was able to find, either an image or a description of an image or a description of the photographer, who respectively which was based in, traveling in, or taken, the image was taken in an area that roughly corresponds to the Russian Empire's Caucasus Viceroyalty, northern Iran, so Iranian Azerbaijan, and the vilayets between Trabzon and Van. But this database points to the study's biggest methodological problem. It is very fragmented and very dispersed. So the fragmented nature of this archive, it influences the cases where an in-depth analysis of their integration into these networks is actually feasible, as in the case of the vast majority of these photographers, little more than their names, the cities where they were living and working, and maybe the studios' names and the addresses of these studios are researchable. So my archival work really suggests that a group of almost self-selecting, roughly 20 photographers, about whom I was able to collect more biographical data, more extensive biographical data, and the corpus of at least 30 photographs, they will make up the core of my qualitative analysis. I'm not going to list them all now, but they are, with the exception of Georgian Nino Georgiadze, exclusively men of all ages. They often share a background in the military or an education in the fine arts. Yeah. I mean, there's really an incompleteness of archival traces and subsequent broken edges, preventing an analysis of potentially productive clusters. So this is, yeah, the most difficult thing about this research. So a lot of questions coming up here eventually. I'm adding to this database of photographers, a database of images, which currently includes around 2,500 images, mechanically produced images. Around 70% of them are I can attribute them to this list of the 20 photographers. And I'm looking at these images by methods of visual content analysis. So I look to group these collected images into recurring motives, which are then systematically grouped into types, type being different from a motive in terms of its degree of abstraction, reducing the denotation of the individual motive to the pictorial statement. And the preliminary formation of such types, it suggests several things. For instance, an obsession with antiquity against the backdrop of a vision of a dormant and degraded land long after its fall from grace, to quote from Jossel's Orientalism and Empire. It is an inclusive imagery of multi-ethnic empires, but also imaginations of ethnic national homelands. One can see parallel imaginations of idyll and inspiration, but also of turmoil. There are increasingly inclusive family portraits, and this aspect will be important for the second part of this presentation now. Visualized aspects of the region's industrialization, pointing at an understanding of its transition into a malleable province, to name a few of these. So I'm also trying to connect these conclusions of visual patterns and strategies to the idea of actor network theory, that everything is part of constantly shifting networks with ever-changing connections between the actors involved. And I thereby particularly look to describe both the non-human agencies in photographic practices, that is, for instance, the camera, the chemicals, etc., how they took an influence on the development of practices, and the global connectedness of the local. So just to sum this first part up, I look to map patterns of entanglement between local and global agency in early photography. And I'm doing that beyond a traditional art historical approach, considering single images for their aesthetic qualities as the results of a particular photographer's mastery of the art. But I suggest to look for the networks of actors embedded in social, cultural, economic, political, whatever relations of a global dimension, potentially taking on local adaptations or hybridizations. So just a few words about these first steps. The story of the invention of photography is a story circling around Paris and London, quite rightfully so. But photography was discussed among Russian scientists in his earliest days. The news of Daguerre's demonstration of his innovation, as well as of Talbot's results, naturally aroused interest in the Russian Empire, and it motivated the Academy of Sciences to send its members to London, to Paris, to inform themselves about the latest developments. Joseph Hammer, an Academy correspondent, frequently sent updates along with materials from Paris and London back to St. Petersburg. And based on these first works, the Academy's leading physicists and chemists, they were ordered to analyze these first products, these first daguerreotypes, and to find ways to improve their quality also. Before mentioned chemist Carl Julius Fritzsche, for instance, he was instructed to analyze and improve Talbot's method. And this study would eventually become the very first scientific analysis of Talbot's method overall. And a technical development in photography to come from Russia during these days was the application of the Russian-German physicist Moritz von Jacobi's galvanoplastic in the process of fixating the image on plates. And I mentioned already Alexei Grikov. He was one of the first professional photographers. He was also able to reduce the exposure time to 2 minutes, which on the one hand, it contributed to the technological development of the camera, and on the other hand, it was again received, discussed. Naturally, the international echo to his work was quite substantial. So soon photography was no longer a mere scientific project, but increasingly became an important role, an important part in public life. Materials and cameras became more easily available over the years, but it certainly remained an expensive occupation and product for many decades to come. So, well, despite photography remaining an expensive elite project for the rest of the century, gradually the camera and the photograph became a key medium in cultural production, and the development of 19th century photography in the Russian Empire followed a very similar path to that of the new technology in Western Europe. In the Caucasus, well, photo studios, they opened in centers of imperial rule, of urban life during the 1840s, but it spread very unequally to certain regions, also to the South Caucasus. Photographers from Western Europe and from Russia, they came to Tiflis, Tbilisi, in order to attract the interest in the city's high society and an innovation that was not yet an everyday technology, but a new instrument also of state representation, and was certainly confined to the financial possibilities of the upper class to afford a prestigious portrait. The first ateliers were established, newspapers informed the readership about new photographers arriving in town, etc. But Baku, which will be in the center of attention in my presentation, and now the first photograph known to stem from Baku was taken only well, in the 1860s. And two reasons might serve to explain the early concentration of regional photography in Tiflis. On the one hand, the city was certainly a capital of the region, of the Caucasus Viceroyalty, the political, cultural, economic center of the region. It therefore saw a higher level of international exchange and a corresponding influx of travelers from major cities of the empire and of Western Europe. And Baku only became the center of the governorate of the same name in 1859, when an earthquake in the former capital, Shamachi, caused the local government to move. I would argue that the rapid industrialization of Baku in the second half of the 19th century would then lead to an eventual omnipresence of photography in the city at the Caspian Sea. But on the other hand, so another factor that certainly played in here is that pictorial traditions were strongly influenced by religious dogmata in the 19th century. So in the Caucasus region, we have practitioners of different Christian churches, Judaism, Sunni Islam, Shia Islam. So it really served as a microcosm of the globally diverging reception of photography, which ranged between enthusiastic acceptance and categorical rejection. In Russia's case, photography met with enthusiasm, great expectations. Many of the first steps were really taken in the first few years. But as an elite project, photography had the function of linking visual cultures based on orthodox pictorial traditions to developing visual cultures of Western modernity. And in Tiflis now, we have a population that was predominantly Christian. The majority was Armenian. And when the introduction of photography encountered a variety of pictorial traditions in the multi-confessional region, reactions within the Orthodox community were overwhelmingly positive, especially among Armenians, for whom the image held no liturgical significance. So the image was not in the center of the liturgy, and they were thus able to embrace this innovation very openly. On the other hand, we have skepticism prevailing among the Muslim population, which could hardly connect its traditional visual practices to the photographic image. This skepticism, for instance, did not necessarily extend to the Ottoman sultans or Persian shahs, who were very eager in showing interest in the earliest developments of photography. And as a result, we do have state-funded photography here, a lot actually, but the pioneering photographers in the Ottoman and Persian empires were almost exclusively Christians. And this is certainly of importance also for the city of Baku. To shortly speak about the state here making use of photography. in order to create and to consolidate its own representation of the Caucasus and of other regions as well, of course. We have many famous examples here: the 1867 All-Russian Ethnographic Exhibition, the generous funding of Gorsky's work in the early 20th century. They all underscore this ambition of the Russian state to make use of photography. And another example would be that in the Russian Caucasus Army, a photography unit was already established in the early 1860s. And these graduates of the military topography school, they were instructed to document both the landscape and the lives and customs of the population. Many of the names of these photographers are not known anymore, but their work is representative of the empire's endeavor to generate a state-controlled visual narrative about the integration and about the technological progress of the region and in the region. One prominent recurring element in early photography in the Caucasus is the documentation of growth of industrial infrastructure, the emphasis on construction sites, roads, railway tracks, as documented, for instance, here in an 1870 series by the Tiflis-based photographer Vladimir Barkanov. And this is one example of the visual imperialism that stressed the contrast between progress through industrialization and the periphery. Here, the building of the railway station in Tbilisi or Tiflis. It remains to be clarified whether Barkanov was one of the graduates of this Caucasus Army photography unit, but the state definitely relied on his services during the Russia-Ottoman War of 1877-1878, when he extensively documented the Caucasus front as a war correspondent and embraced industrial technological photography, which supported a vision of the transition of the Caucasus into a province to be exploited and developed. Now, he certainly did not have Baku in mind when in 1977, Roland Barthes posited in an interview that photography and film were pure products of the Industrial Revolution and that photography was treated as an orphan of high culture. Of course, his criticism was primarily directed at the lack of a theoretical debate on photography, a situation that has certainly changed for the better. But these two observations are interesting with respect to the development of photography in this southeasternmost corner of the Russian Empire. On the one hand, we still have little research on the development of photography on the territory of today's Republic of Azerbaijan. And a theoretical debate is also yet just to start on local particularities here of visual cultures based on pictorial traditions of Islam, the Armenian networks, transmitting photographic knowledge across imperial boundaries from and into the neighboring Ottoman and Qajar empires, the increasing influx of Western European travelers equipped with cameras and their influence in the representation and perception of the region. But there's also yet no real scholarship on the development of the local visual cultures. But on the other hand, and this is the key aim of this part now, I will attempt to illustrate the connection between this advent of photography and the industrialization of the Russian Empire's southern borderlands. It's a story both of the Industrial Revolution facilitating the global exchange of photographic practices and the photography as a welcome vehicle for promoting imperial integration through the narrative of industrial progress. Against the backdrop of the city of Baku's position as a center of global economic activity at the turn of the 20th century and related interest in documenting the source of its growth and wealth, that is primarily the oil springs and their exploitation, I would say that the increasing internationalization of the city during the development of the oil industry decisively contributed to the introduction of new technologies, one of which was photography, but also film. From a global perspective, the city of Baku belatedly witnessed the advent of photography, but the latest introduction into a cosmopolitan environment with a booming economy that drew foreign interest and investment is certainly a story of co-constructed knowledge at the dawn of World War I. So to go to Baku now, this is the earliest known photograph of the city in the early 1860s. I'm writing here circa 1863. One cannot with certainty rule out the possibility that images were actually taken or produced before that and eventually lost, but the geographical and peripheral position of the Baku governorate and the skepticism towards visual representation among its Muslim majority population make the belated arrival of photography in the city quite plausible. However, this tide was certainly turning by the years of the oil boom, and Baku became an interesting site and subject also. The oil boom, it fostered technological advancements. We have a connection to Tiflis and then to Vladikavkaz and Moscow by a telegraph line in 1868. We have foreign expertise and investment provided by German company Siemens and Halske, opening up new horizons for local workmen. A decade later, Baku was connected to Krasnovodsk on the opposite shore of the Caspian Sea, and the modern telephone network was set up from the mid-1880s, and by 1914, the electrification of Baku was in full swing. So the former small town had become a trans-regional center of commerce and innovation by the start of World War I. Or as Audrey Alstad put it, Baku was the first Muslim city to industrialize on a large scale with the use of foreign capital and capitalists and European technology, technocrats, managers, and advisors. Now, these first photographs of Baku were taken by Alexander Ulski. This coincided with the establishment of refineries on the shores of the Caspian Sea and Russian expeditions tasked with studying the geology of the Absheron Peninsula. He again had graduated as an officer of the Marine Corps, acquired knowledge of astronomy at the Pulkovo Observatory, and then joined an expedition that investigated the Caspian seabed. He rose through the ranks to become captain lieutenant before passing away at the age of 32 in 1868. And he's another example of a military photo pioneer in the Caucasus region. His photos primarily feature panoramic views of the city skyline taken from the shore, as well as parts of Baku's old walled city. It is assumed that his pioneer work remained a private endeavor. He never actually included his photography in his scientific studies. He did not do so as a method of documentation, nor were these images widely circulated. However, this work indicates that the state's increasing interest in the exploration, in the exploitation of the region's resources also initiated the introduction of other technological innovations, such as photography. And now we actually have news of an industrial boomtown, and travelers from Western Europe no longer ended their travels somewhere in Tiflis and then continuing on to the Persian Empire, but they actually continued on to Baku. So Alexandre Dumas is, of course, one of the earliest examples in the late 1850s. He encountered a very sleepy Baku, but in Knut Hamsun's In Wonderland, based on a visit to the region in 1899, he described a city that had changed massively. By then, a considerable number of photographers had already contributed to its popularization, and one of them is his, so Dumas' French compatriot, soldier, and amateur photographer, Paul Lacrenon. He toured across Europe for 6 months in 1891, and this was a journey that took him into the Russian Empire and down the Volga River and across the Caucasus, or along the Caucasus through Azerbaijan and Georgia back to France. His photographs primarily document his arrival in Baku on the Zang. He focused on views of the city and the ship. He did not go too far from the port, from what I can take from the images. But these images indicate that his short visit to Baku took him straight to the commercial elite of the city. One photograph here on the left-hand side shows oil magnate Tagiev with the family of a gentleman assumed to have been one of his senior managers, and who was portrayed individually in another shot referred to as Monsieur Saint-Marc. And the image on the right-hand side here shows an oil refinery. In general, oil derricks, those in Longrenon's images probably belong to Taguiev's company. They would soon become the standard object to represent Baku for almost any photographer coming to the city. Yeah, but by the 1890s, travelers were not only interested in, or they were not only increasingly discovering Baku's oil fields as interesting motifs, but they also looked further to the east and across the Caspian Sea. The Russian state used its expansion into Central Asia extensively to present itself as a great power with a civilizing mission in its newly acquired territories. This policy was implemented in various visual forms within the empire itself, but it also attracted foreigners to visit the general governorate of Turkestan, often choosing the route via Baku and across the Caspian Sea. A fair in Tashkent in 1890 became a platform for the celebration of colonial achievements, and it not only encouraged some of the Russian state's highest representatives, Vishnegradsky or Witte, to take the Trans-Caspian Railway towards the southeast, but it also sparked the interest of another French photographer who accepted an invitation to join the celebratory exhibition, Paul Nadal Tournachon. He arrived in Baku in 1890, and his equipment included a Kodak camera, developed by George Eastman only a couple of years before that. And this camera, it made photography a much more practical endeavor. So he did not only take numerous photographs during his travels. So he brought more than 1,200 negatives back to France. Many of them are now on display in museums. But he also produced a series of scenes of everyday life, including portraits of women, of children in the streets of Baku. The city's modernizing infrastructure attracted Nadal. The photograph here of the Baku railway station does reflect that. It is the railway station was built as part of the extension of the Trans-Caucasus Railway to Baku in the early 1880s. And the station did become a popular subject of postcards from Baku. And it is also connected to another innovation here, a horse car tramway. But it is really this question of the everyday life scenes that comes the more into the cameras. Yeah, this is already Joseph Debye, but another one was Kraft, who visited Baku in the 1890s. His more famous travelogue, À travers le Turkestan russe, based on a visit to Central Asia in 1899, overshadows his journey through the Caucasus in the previous months, but it nonetheless proved productive, and he also brought more than 500 shots of the region back to France. His interesting here is the correspondence by Kraft. It shows that he had not initially planned to cross the Caspian Sea at all, but he had grabbed the opportunity for a trip to Baku for 2 or 3 days when he was made to wait to pick up photographic prints in Tiflis. He gives an insight into his photographic activities in Baku in a report for the Paris Photo Club Bulletin, in which he describes his equipment and praised it for having been useful in taking quick shots of bazaar scenes, moving crowds, popular festivities, when he was eager to avoid any attention among the Muslim or other public. He furthermore stressed that he was able to take all his photos, with the exception of a handful taken in an atelier outdoors at different times of day and in different lighting conditions. And a key figure to inform Kraft on the region was Joseph Debye, a French archaeologist, who had developed an interest in the study of the Russian Empire. He published extensively in Georgia, as well as some areas north of the Caucasus mountain range. And he was an enthusiastic photographer, took more than 600 photos in Georgia alone. And his Baku visits proved similarly productive. And like Kraft's photographs, his shots suggest that he was able to rely on a new generation of cameras, which allowed him to quickly capture scenes in the streets of the old town, including street vendors carrying their goods, veiled women passing by, and women doing the laundry in the port of Baku. The photograph of the two friends, Kraft and Debye, reflect the progress in camera technology that allowed them to add ethnographic scenes to the more static display of industrial sites. While infrastructure and technology were still primary motives in early Baku photography, the introduction of lighter and smaller cameras facilitated the traveling photographer's ambition to capture scenes of everyday life against religiously motivated skepticism towards photography among parts of the city's population. Well, there were, of course, not only Western European travelers equipped with a camera contributing to the development of the visual legacy in Imperial Baku. Dmitry Yermakov was probably the most prominent and most productive photographer in the region at the time. In 1896, he published a catalog with a collection of 18,000 views and types. And his collection today, I think it encompasses 25,000 or more than 25,000 photos in the Georgian National Museum. But again, the life and oeuvre of Yermakov combined several typical features of early photography in the region. We have him as a graduate of the military topography school, establishing a photography business in Tiflis in the 1870s or around 1870. His studio became really a hub of exchange between him and his students and travelers like Antoine Sevroguin or Kraft, who had visited Yermakov to get his photos printed. And he was also in frequent communication with photographers in Western Europe, beyond welcoming them to the studio in Tiflis. So he took part in an exhibition in Paris in 1874. Alongside Barkanov, he exhibited 17 photos of Asian Turkey in a series called Vidi Typy v Caucaza. And based on his military education, he also joined his fellow exhibitor on the battlefields of the Russo-Ottoman War and participated there as a war photography. But other than the passing traveler, Yermakov worked on a broader chronicle of the region that relied on staged photography using large plates rather than pictures taken with a handheld camera, like here in Dubai or also Kraft. And so at a time when photographic enlargement was had not yet been developed, his scenes of Baku were captured on plates of up to 28 times 38 centimeters in size. So, and similar to also the photos in the Baku and Yelizavetpol governorates, and these indicate that Yermakov had actually traveled with his bulky equipment all across the region. In Baku, the photographer's ethnographic and anthropological interest was less satisfied. So the majority of his images, again, display the oil fields and factories of foreign and domestic investors. This is one of his Baku images. In general, we have photos of oil derricks and new railway tracks becoming indispensable illustrations in any book about Baku, and beyond the turn of the century. So I have another slide here. This is from Charles Marvin, English journalist and travel writer. He unfortunately does not reveal the identity of the photographers who provided him with the images of here, for instance, the Noble brothers number 25 well, but it is very likely that he purchased some of Yermakov's photos if you compare that to the image on the left, which is from Yermakov's catalog. And German industrialists, Max Albrecht, however, he had established his company Mineralölwerke Albrecht & Co. in Baku and traveled there also into Central Asia, publishing his Russisch Zentralasien, Reisebilder aus Transkaspien, Bukhara and Turkestan in 1896. And he indicated that he had relied on two Tiflis-based photographers, namely Alexander Engel and Grigory Babalov, as well as on the works of the probably most renowned photographer to establish himself in pre-war Baku, and that is Alexandre Michon, my last example now. Alexandre Michon had a particularly significant influence on the development of the photography scene in Baku. He was born to a Polish-French family, had migrated to the Kharkov governorate in the 1850s, and his path towards fame as an influential pioneer of photography in the Southern Russian Empire was probably predestined, as his father had opened the first studio in the city of Slavyansk already. So in Slavyansk or Kharkov, the portrait photography provided an income to the Michon family, but industrial photography soon gained its attention when Michon, whether Mikhail or already Alexander remains uncertain, but one of them chose to travel to Yuzovka, today's Donetsk, and to take photos of the factory founded by Welsh engineer John Hughes, who also gave the city his name. Either way, he followed his father's footsteps, learned the photography trade, and a decade later, the photo studio already went by the son's name. He eventually moved to Baku in 1884, and he would have a decisive influence on the emergence of photography over the next quarter of a century. Within 3 years, he had received a permit to run a photo studio, so it took quite a while, obviously. But as soon as it opened, he reached out to a wider audience. We have lots of advertisements in the newspapers, Caffee, for instance, informing its readers about the new studio on Central Targovaya Ulica, which aside from portraits offered landscape photography and accepted orders for shots of factories, businesses, architectural buildings for the most inexpensive prices. From then onwards, he could read his name frequently, printed in bold letters above a 3-line commercial in the same newspaper. And he seems to have provided tourists with views of the Caucasus, the Trans-Caucasus region, and other localities, as a curious anecdote about a group of Chinese traveling to Orenburg via Baku and Astrakhan and shopping at Michon's premises reveals. His activities included lecturing on photographic theory and practice, and he also engaged in organizing Baku's Circle of Photography Amateurs. His participation in exhibitions in Paris, St. Petersburg, and Tiflis, in addition to interaction with photographers traveling to Baku, represents the lively exchange of knowledge that took place between locally based photographers and colleagues based in other parts of the Russian Empire or in Western Europe, through which technological advancements such as the new smaller cameras of the late 1880s also reached the photo studios on the shores of the Caspian Sea. By the end of the decade, however, Michon was not satisfied with the state of photojournalism in Baku. He decided to take matters into his own hands, so he was already the interim editor of the Baku Ежегодник, and he launched his own journal, Caucasus Средняя Азия, Photographic описаниях. The first issue was published in November 1899. You can see here on the top an advertisement also in the Tbilisi-based Armenian language newspaper Mshak on the launch of the new journal. So the news on this journal must have spread quickly across the region. And this monthly illustrated journal, it existed for almost 10 years, but only 1 or 2 issues, if at all, were published each year before Michon left the city of Baku and moved back to the Kharkov governorate in 1908. Again, in this journal, oil industry was prominently discussed and visualized in the majorities of its issues. The first number, for instance, opened with a 2-part story on the kingdom of oil, that is Baku, and 2 of the 5 full-page images, all taken by Michon himself, show production in the oil fields of Baku. His very prominent position, also retrospectively seen, of course, resulted also to a great extent from his pioneering role in establishing film in the city of Baku. But he was neither the first nor the only photographer in Imperial Baku. Contemporary data suggests that 14 officially registered photographers were running businesses in town in the year that Michon left, so 1908. While at least 45 photographers and or studios are known to have operated at some time in pre-revolutionary Baku. Some of these had come from other parts of the empire, like Michon, for instance, or the Polish military topographer Julian Zielinski. Some might have come from abroad, such as Henryk Levin, about whom is only known that he established the English studio, which doesn't have to mean a lot. But many stem from the city's Armenian community. Georgi Shamkharov, or Shamkharian, for instance, he opened his studio Georges already in 1883, and he turned out to be not only the first, but also one of the most productive and long-lasting establishments. And he offered his clients portrait photographs and an array of local and Trans-Caspian views and types. Other photographers here included Melikian, Babayan with his Rembrandt studio, all the brothers Vasily and David Rostamian, who also worked as court photographers to the Persian Shah. All of their clientele consisted of the urban middle and upper classes that sought to secure portraits of themselves and their families, and they weren't confined to Baku's Armenian community. So the city's Armenian community, as the Armenian photographers, contributed significantly to the development of the photography scene through lively exchange of knowledge. Shamkharov had an administrative role in Baku's circle of photography amateurs. Photographs by Melikian won a gold medal at an international exhibition in Antwerp, while David Rostamian, similarly to Yermakov and Sevroguin, took photography across imperial boundaries in the south by advertising himself as court photographer to the Persian Shah. Ashken Aristakova, here on the right-hand side, she's one of the very few women to pioneer photography in the region. She was also part of Baku's Armenian community, but it is not known for how long she managed to keep her studio running. So in general, I think it seems reasonable to say that Armenians had a significant influence on the formation of local photographic practices, the influence that might have resembled the role of Armenian networks in bringing early photography to the Ottoman Empire, and one that certainly deserves further investigation, but it remains difficult to access and delicate to address when doing your research. The work of Baku's Armenian photographers, it exemplifies how photographic practices were subject to processes of negotiation rather than linear transfer, insofar as photography was not only exclusively brought to the imperial periphery by Russians or foreigners, but also taken up by parts of the local urban population who were integrated into far-reaching networks of exchange in the city's dynamic 80s and 90s. So to come to an end now, slowly, Michon left Baku in 1908. So the oil boom had slowed down. Political and ethnic unrest frequently struck the city, and photography by then had already become firmly established. And the considerable number of studios covered the ever-increasing demand for representative photographic images across the city's social and economic upper class, mostly upper class. Although fierce competition must have characterized the first decades of business, both in the oil sector and among the photo studios, in both cases, the internationalization of the city contributed to innovation and co-constructive processes of knowledge creation that left an imprint on its economic and cultural development. Growing in parallel and yet intertwined with one another, the oil industry and photography in Baku profited from the city's increasing importance in a globalizing economy in the latter half of the 19th century. The oil boom on the Caspian shore was accompanied by an influx of foreign investors and travelers who turned part of the city into cosmopolitan platforms of exchange. Technological innovation in the form of oil pipelines and tankers shaped the image of a progressive city. In the field of photography, this meant that travelers were eager to document this process. The portfolio of anyone visiting with a camera included industrial photographs, while the international companies in the city were then again interested in promoting their facilities with exactly these images. And at the same time, the Russian Empire's ambition to promote the successful integration of its periphery led to the utilization of these photographs, in which oil derricks and railway tracks were selected to represent a region and the appropriation of new technology. As the century progressed and the capability of photography advanced, the technological development of the cameras in use transformed photographic practices. The arrival of smaller and lighter devices resulted in the opportunity to picture ethnographic scenes among parts of the population, that were initially skeptical towards new visual technologies. Sinking prices broadened the studio's clientele from the top of the oil oligarchy to include the grower upper and middle classes. And so in general, the Industrial Revolution indeed produced photography in Baku against the backdrop of international exchange and shaped by the co-construction of knowledge. Yet still, the history of early photography in the city of Baku, as well as in the wider Caucasus region, for what it's worth, mostly remains a historiographical orphan, to go back to Barth, overshadowed by the glitz and glamour of the oil boom years. However, and I'm really closing now on this note, it offers multiple promising fields for future research, I think. To name only a few, it remains to be clarified how Baku's local photography scene was connected to global networks of photographic exchange, how, from where, and by whom were cameras, chemicals, other materials imported and sold. Are there like parallels to Oni Diradorian, who sold the Kodak #1 cameras in the Ottoman Empire? How did contacts form that led Baku photographers to exhibit their work at exhibitions in Western Europe, where the Armenian photographers of the city integrated into a wider network of exchange, arranged along ethnic lines that reached fellow photographers in the Russian centers of commerce, into the other South Caucasus governorates and further into the Ottoman Empire. These are some of the aspects that I'm working on, but I'd be more than thankful if you could add some more questions to my list. Thank you.
Okay, so at this point, I'll unmute myself and offer some questions and remarks about Dominik's presentation. Thank you so much, Dominik, for this fascinating paper that you've shared with us. So the first question that I have is about this interface between indigenous photographic practice in the Caucasus and foreign photographers or photographers from the Russian metropole. You mentioned that religion plays a role in the ways photography is either embraced or repudiated by different local ethnic groups or different segments of society. And I would love to hear more about this. It seems that there's a lot going on in addition to what seems to be a dogmatic aversion to representations of the human form on the part of Muslims. And I was really struck by your the images of the Muslim oil baron Tagiev, who's consenting to be photographed in the late 1890s. I'm curious to know what kinds of archival sources tell us about the embrace or aversion to photography. Where do we turn to get a clear picture of attitudes to photography, and whether those attitudes correspond to religious or ethnic or urban-rural or class divisions or some combination of these things? And I'm also curious if proximity to Russian imperial power might also be underlying what seems to be this divided response to photography that happens along religious lines in the South Caucasus. Relatedly, on the topic of the Baku photography entrepreneur, Alexandre Michon, I'm intrigued by the data you showed about the number of registered photography studios in Baku. And this made me think about the bureaucratic aspects of photography in the Russian Empire, as well as all other media at this time. I'm curious, what did it take to get officially registered as a commercial photography studio in the Russian Empire? And also, what would it take to have this privilege taken away? Was camera equipment regulated by the Russian government in any way? I'm thinking similar to printing presses. Were photographs censored? Were regulations put on their circulation across international borders? On a related note, I'm wondering if you can tell us more about how private or commercial or amateur photography is comparing to state-sanctioned or institutional photography. Are the same people involved in both spheres of photographic practice? Does this affect things like the subject matter of a photograph, genre considerations, or aesthetic, or other aspects of the photographic gaze? So in addition to these questions that are specific to the circumstances of the South Caucasus. I also have a few general questions about photography and empire. So I'm struck by this evolution of photographic practice that seems to take place throughout the late 19th century. So the ways that technological innovations, like the availability of cheaper and more mobile photographic equipment, have this democratizing effect. And of course, in Baku, as you illustrated so beautifully for us, this is combining with massive social, political, and economic changes that are brought about by the oil boom in the years leading up to the 1905 and 1917 revolutions. So overall, this seems to be coinciding with a broader moment when empires fall and nations or national ideas rise to take their place. So I have kind of a line of questioning in line with this. If these transnational networks of photographic practice can ultimately tell us more about imperial power, imperial knowledge, and the imperial imagination, does the evolution of photographic practice also tell us something significant about the rise and fall of empires at this time? Do we see any kind of a national idea or an alternative to an imperial imagination emerging from photographic networks in the Caucasus at the end of the 19th century? And I'm also reminded of your introductory example of Pushkin's Kafkaysky Plennik, where the Caucasus is this newly acquired and hotly contested territory that's introduced to the Russian Empire through Pushkin's work or integrated into the Russian imperial imagination for the first time. And then towards the end of this age of empires, it seems that photography is starting to trickle down to the upper and middle echelons of Baku society, and the empire itself is in this process of disintegration and destabilization. And the Caucasus is being completely riven by political violence. So do these kinds of upheavals also come across in the networks of photographic practice? Does ANT provide for a way of analyzing ruptures in networks? And can these ruptures in networks tell us as much as the connections? And so one final set of questions about your titular concept of the camera Caucasia. So I am just fascinated by the way it's emerging as this dynamic thing that is, on the one hand, starting out as a typical tool of empire. It's a lens that's wielded by elites with often an Orientalist gaze that's intent on enforcing imperial hierarchies and regimes of knowledge and power. But it seems to evolve into something else entirely towards the end of the 19th century. And this suggests all these significant things about a dynamic relationship between the photographing subject and the photographed object, as well as both imagined and actual audiences or viewers or consumers of the photographs. So if we have time, I would like to hear more about your thoughts on the overall concept of the camera Caucasia. Is it a portable concept? Is it something that's that can help us understand the way that representation and knowledge is working in other empires? Or does it tell us something key about the nature of empire and representation in general? So that's the end of my comments and questions. And once again, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much. These are so many questions. I have to apologize already if I'm not addressing one or another because I was taking down notes and I cannot read my script anymore. But I'll try to address all of them. The question of religion was one of the first you mentioned, and the question of Tagiev being represented. I mean, it's really a question of skepticism and of pictorial traditions rather than dogmatic refusal to take up these innovations. So there are certain workarounds also in religious ways that extend to Islam, for instance. So there were the sultans, the shahs, they were among the first to embrace this technology for self-representation, and they also found ways around any religious skepticism. The problem, it's not a problem, but if you see in the Ottoman Empire, for instance, you have Western painting and photography arriving at the very same time. So photography could not that easily connect to pictorial traditions as in other parts. And therefore, for instance, we have hardly any Muslim photographers in the Ottoman Empire. So in Istanbul, for instance, the first Muslim photographer to open a studio did so only in 1910. So 70 years after the introduction of photography, and after photography had been very, very productive in the city of Istanbul, for instance. We have more than 60 photo studios, but they were run primarily by Christians, by Greeks, by Armenians, by Western Europeans. So that is the one thing of the question of religion here also. And because Tagiev was willing to have his photo taken, he was certainly no exception, because the very act of having a portrait taken would have signaled a claim to modern identity for those pictured as they participated in this imported or newly adopted social practice. So this is, I think, more than a question of religion. Also, one of the first questions was this question of indigenous and foreign and global and local, etc. I'm just saying, I wouldn't go so far as to see any universalism behind the question of global and local, and I'm not understanding them as anything binary, as anything opposite, but it really is an amalgamation of local practices that again stem from these local pictorial traditions with maybe different religious backgrounds that all have an influence of these pictorial traditions, and the possibility to connect to these to find different ways to express photographic practices. But it is not something different from like Western European Euro-Atlantic norms, for instance. So this would be a wrong direction. And I think it's also not plausible because we have mixed clientele and audiences everywhere. This is the same in British India as here in Baku, for instance, with a lot of travelers among the first photographers, but also among the first customers, if we see the many foreigners coming to Baku as entrepreneurs. Then again, ANT I think is interesting because it really tends to describe rather than interpret here. And this is so important with this fragmented archive because you have so many ruptures. And there are many ruptures that you cannot really work around. This also goes into the question of your archival sources. Because it's not so easy very often to find anything. I mean, you have a lot of written ego documents, obviously letters, correspondence, diaries that give you an indication of how photography was embraced, of how people tended to make use of photography, how people accepted a portrait, what kind of value the portrait had within families. Yeah, but these ruptures definitely they exist, and one has to well accept them, I guess, because the archival situation is as it is for these questions. Then I have something with the national idea and the question of imperial imagination. I mean, well, certainly you can read into imperial imaginations here as well, and you can certainly find. I mean, photography reflects these developments. They do not create these developments, and of course you see increasing nationalism among searching groups. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, you have an imagination of an Armenian native land. And this also reflects in photographs, for instance. If you take a look at the photos by Matthias Papazians, for instance, you can see a very clear idea of Armenian national lands. And again, here photography reflects regulations. Yeah, certainly. We do have clear regulations. What is needed for a photography studio to be run? I mean, it's bureaucracy. It really is bureaucracy. It is nothing too fancy, I think, but it really just takes time to get all the paperwork together and to have a studio being allowed to open. But I wouldn't know too much about the bureaucratic procedures, to be honest. And please remind me if I have now because I wasn't able to take everything down. If I have something very important, if I missed something very important, I'm very sorry, but could you just repeat that maybe? I think you're muted.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, this is really illuminating, and it's providing answers to many of these questions that I had. On the topic of bureaucracy, I'm also just wondering about censorship at the same time. Were there things that were not possible to take pictures of or circulate photographs of? Were there any restrictions put on the circulation of pictures?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this is two different aspects. On the one hand, you have, of course, the state censorship, and on the other hand, you have a societal censorship of things that weren't I don't know, where the customers weren't interested in having that seen on photographs. Also the question of, and that's what I meant with increasingly inclusive family portraits, where you can see an increasing amount of women also appearing on these photos. So you have a clear development here. So this is maybe a societal censorship coming again from this maybe religiously motivated perspective. From the state as well, yeah, sure. In the South Caucasus, I think it's not that strict, for instance, on infrastructure, obviously, because it's one of the key elements to promote imperial integration. Whereas in other parts of the empire, it was rather difficult to take photos of the progress of infrastructure, where you can find sources on where it says that one was not allowed to take these photos as well. Yeah, but I have to say I did not come across yet any documentation of a photo where it said, I don't know, censored on it, or where there was a comment to it in the archival sources. So I wouldn't know. I could only guess what kind of photos were not allowed to be taken.
If I may, maybe one more question about I guess about timelines and about the upheavals that are occurring in not only the Russian Empire, but also the neighboring Ottoman and Qajar empires in the early 20th century. So the camera Caucasia, your concept of the camera Caucasia is something that's unique to a 19th century imperial context. Does it have an endpoint? Is there a point where the nature of photography completely changes so as to become something else entirely?
No, I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so that photography is changing as there would be a clear endpoint to that. I mean, the endpoint of my work is really the imperial point of view, because I try to find reflections of imperial developments here in my work. So that goes basically up until the end of the First World War. But it's certainly nothing particular for this imperial setting only. So you can certainly find similar developments in other parts as well. And this is again the question of connecting local practices to global dimensions, because photography, it works the same way everywhere, but it reflects different social and cultural realities. But the mechanism of the camera is certainly the same in other realms as well.
So what we're observing is a constant evolution of these networks of different actors that are creating the phenomenon of photography that aren't necessarily disrupted by the end of empires. It's just a continual.
No, certainly. I think in the 19th century, what is interesting is that technology really develops a lot. So that, for instance, the introduction of the handheld camera automatically revolutionizes also the photographic practices, because you're able to take these snapshots on the street, hidden shots. You don't have the question of the earliest photos with, I don't know, 2-minute exposure time, etc. anymore. So that obviously transforms photographic practices in itself, something that is probably, well, at least until the introduction of the digital camera at the end of the 20th century, you cannot observe this fast technical evolution throughout the beginning of the 20th century.
Thank you so much. So I've reached the end of my questions, so I will now turn the floor over to our moderators for the general discussion. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Naomi.
So I have opened up the chat and people can send in their messages or request to speak. And I will call on people and read out questions in the order I receive them. Great. So we have a question from Ingrid Kleespies. Ingrid, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Dominik, thank you. This really interesting talk. And I guess I just wanted to build maybe a little bit on Naomi's question and ask if you could expand maybe a little bit more on how the Russian imperial photographic tradition might be situated in comparison to the other Western European imperial photographic traditions, British and French, for example. I'm thinking that there's so much scholarship with imperial photography that focuses on race and ethnography and this kind of aspect or maybe angle or pointing of the lens. So your discussion of like this industrial aesthetic is really, really interesting. And I'm wondering how unique that is to the Russian context, how much that might actually kind of be part and parcel of a larger European imperial photographic gaze. But at any rate, I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, in general, we can see a lot of parallels in imperial photography also to other empires. I think the importance of industrial photography here in the Russian case is quite striking. I don't see it as that important in many other cases, but it is, of course, one of the prime examples to underline any civilizing mission, because you know, the narrative of bringing progress, of bringing innovation, of bringing industrialization into a once peripheral, economically underdeveloped region is quite, well, it is easy to pick up on that. On the other hand, the question of racial photography, of ethnographic photography, there are certainly lots of parallels also to other parts of imperial photography, to other empires. I mean, not only British or French cases, but also in terms of I don't know, Japan maybe, where you can also see different aspects of an exotic Japan, or here an exotic Caucasus, which certainly exists. I mean, this was also a business model. We have selling of postcards, we have carte de visite. So we have a lot of these orientalizing images also from the Caucasus region. They were just not part here of my presentation because I wanted to focus on something else. But these images, they tended to confirm Western stereotypes about the region, about the region's exotic nature, about something exotic there. So images that try to portray costumes, customs, ethnographic types, focusing on people's engaged in traditional activities and wearing traditional clothes, etc., which often conveniently omits any kind of I don't know, adopted latest Western fashions, for instance. As example of Japan, probably more than rather here. Still, lots of parallels there, definitely.
Harsha Ram, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominik. I actually think that your research is more advanced than you give yourself credit for. So it was a very interesting talk. Thank you. Mm-hmm. You've partly answered this question in your response to Ingrid Kleespies, but let me formulate it slightly differently. I'm interested in the sort of the methodological assumptions and the narrative that you've constructed for us, which, as Ingrid pointed out, is a slightly different one to the one that we're often used to in thinking about 19th century photography in the empire. And I was wondering if I wanted to examine a little bit your methodological assumptions and then push you in a slightly different direction, but not in order to critique you, but rather to see how you might be able to bring these two sides into a kind of dialogue. So the sort of the narrative you've presented for us essentially is a kind of despecifying narrative, which involves the kind of a global modern technology, right, which is the camera, a network model of cultural practitioners who are largely translocal and itinerant. And then thirdly, also a kind of an objective focus on modern infrastructure and also the nascent industrialization of the Caucasus, right? And while I'm not questioning the legitimacy of that narrative, I think it's there and it's amply evidenced in the material that you've presented. I'm wondering also if in some ways it's also specific to the political economy of Baku, and also to the sort of the denationalized and cosmopolitan demographic nature of the city as produced by the petroleum industry. And I'm wondering if one could also produce a slightly different narrative of photography in the Caucasus, which is related to local, not necessarily ethnically local, but certainly geographically local practitioners, who have atelier in Tbilisi, for example. I'm thinking not just of Dmitry Yermakov, but also, for example, of Alexander Roinashvili, who are deeply rooted in local scene, even as they are connected to the kinds of networks that you've mentioned, and who are also doing something that you've already touched upon, but which I wanted to elaborate on very briefly, which is the examination of a kind of an ethnographic model that emerges in the mid-19th century, firstly in literature, and then is then transposed into other discourses such as journalism and finally photography, which is the idea of the type, right? Type, and of ethnotypes as something that is going to become an object of intense literary and then subsequently ethnological and photographic concern. And I think that you're largely right in suggesting that these are, exoticizing, orientalizing, and to some extent fix local customs and ethnicities in a kind of ahistorical frozen moment that is outside time. But I'm wondering if you could also see the same practices as also modes of trying to think about particularity. In other words, they would function as a kind of counterbalance to your discourse or your narrative, which is one of despecifying and departicularizing. I'm wondering if you might want to bring the ethnographic discourse of particularity into a kind of more dialectical relationship to that. And I think that would produce, I think, a fuller narrative of the kind of the push and pull between the modernizing, rather than seeing it as sort of a tension between modernizing and archaicizing. One could see it as a kind of tension between the cosmopolitan and the particular, if you like, right? And that's an idea that's also taken up by local actors. I'm thinking of someone like Roinashvili, for example, who is taking photographs of local elites who are interested in seeing themselves also, caught in a kind of interesting kind of continuum between, local or national customs on the one hand, but also deeply engaged in different kinds of modernizing practices that are transforming the local urban landscape, for example. So basically my suggestion is a kind of more dialectical approach to the relationship between the particular and the general, or between the local and the global, that I think is in spirit with what you're trying to do, but which would perhaps allow for a more dynamic equilibrium.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't see much of a question in there because this is really a very, very much appreciated comment. You're absolutely right. I think this political economy of Baku is one of a kind in the region, and in other parts it certainly looks very, very different. If you take a look at this discourse of native homeland in the Armenian case, for instance, with Papazians, it is again different in comparison to the photos by Yermakov and Roinashvili, which are sometimes not so easy to tell apart. And in terms of this particularity, this is also where the photograph is kind of an autonomous object, because the same photo can work for both narratives. I think it can be both the particular, it can be both the type, yeah, but it can also be co-opted for any political ambition, for any imperial narrative. So the photo per se is not the particular or the general. But thank you very much. This is certainly very helpful. Thanks.
We have a question from Hubertus John. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, Harsha brought it up already. I mean, I was going to talk about Roinashvili a bit myself. And where do you see people in the Caucasus actually pushing the medium itself, i.e. trying montage, trying transposition, these kind of things like Roinashvili's Georgian Dream Come True? You will have seen that with this guy floating on a carpet in front of Mount Kazbegi, surrounded by all this kind of paraphernalia of a Caucasian supra, Georgian supra. So is this something peculiar to the area? And the second question is, where is the empire itself actually coming in? And I'm thinking about the visits of the Tsars, for example, who were, of course, Alexander III in 1888. There were lots of photographs. I mean, did they bring their own photographers, or were these locals who just shooting around, or how did that work? And how was that orchestrated into a bigger image of the empire?
Thank you very much. As for the first question, I really have to say that I don't feel like I'm on top of that particular question. I feel like you might know more than I do about this artistic approach by Roinashvili, so I really cannot really answer that. Where the empire is coming in, you have, I mean, which particular photos do you mean? Visits by state representatives to the Caucasus region, whether they brought along photographers, or is that your question?
Something like that, yes, yes. Or any kind of official ceremonies. 1901, for example, the celebration of, well, the unification, as they called it, of Georgia with Russia. So these kind of official scenes, which were unique. I mean, they were, of course, embedded in the bigger context of the modern stuff that he showed us from Baku. For example, Alexander visited Baku as well, the oil rigs and all of that. But these were one-off events. I mean, these were not part of this kind of static image of modernization. And they will have given a completely different aspect, probably, even by just photobombing people. I mean, people walking into the field of the camera unexpectedly. So in other words, it's not so just this one discourse of modernization with the oil rigs, but it's also something that's happened accidentally during these events.
Yeah, to a certain extent, definitely. But you do have some official approaches to photography very early. So this potential of installation of a certain event, you have that very early. And I mean, they did have photographers. They knew where to go to in Tiflis, for instance. So Yermakov was frequently addressed for official photography. I'm not sure about the photos from Baku, to be honest, because I wouldn't know who would have taken them. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And we have a question from Georgi Papashvili. Georgi, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominik, for your presentation. It's really interesting in many aspects. Let me doubt the scope of this whole topic. That's very wide, and you switched later in the second part to the economic history of photography, to call it this way. I would say that South Caucasian Railway is another subject to study in this case, and it's directly linked, historically linked with oil in Baku, because South Caucasian Railway was built for this reason, first of all, except manganese. And also, I wouldn't agree with some conceptual approaches. You may not agree. You said, if I'm not mistaken, that photography reflects, not creates, those ideological approaches. I can't agree with that because, for example, those photographers which were mentioned by Hubertus and Harsha, Yermakov and Roinashvili had, let's say, opposite approaches. Not only different, but opposite ones. One was colonial, another one was nationalist, and very clearly. And it can be proved biographically, not by, let's say, aesthetical values, but it also matters. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Georgi. To be honest, I didn't really get the first question or comment or criticism, because, of course, I mean, the building of the railway was part of it. I don't really see why it should not be part of the narrative. And for the second part, I mean, again, what I said before, I think that the photo per se is an autonomous object. It is the narrative that frames that photo. And you can use the photo in both ways, in opposite ways. But I wouldn't say that one particular image comes from one particular narrative or creates that one particular narrative, but is really framed by that narrative. I don't know, opposite approaches, that doesn't really mean to me that an image can be put into that one particular drawer only.
Any other questions? Nikita, go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to pick up on Hubertus's comment, and I just sent a link in the chat to the photo album which was produced by the George Studio. I wonder if you're aware of this one. I just came across it this weekend when I was in the State Historical Museum in Moscow, and it was on display, well, digitally, but still it's all available on their website. And also it also this very interesting subject recalled me of the 1882 All Russian exhibition in Moscow, where and the comments on these exhibitions also focused on the juxtaposition of the most developed parts of the empire and those of the opposites. And as it turned out, Finland presented in their department was the most progressive, and the one that was the most underdeveloped was the department of the Caucasus, actually. And one of the commentators suggested that it's only those oil tycoons that somehow are saving the reputation of the Caucasus. And I wonder in this respect whether these photographs, and you've showed us a lot of them, whether they acted as these vehicles of the self-promotions of the region in general, because and I think that it will be interesting to put these images of industrialization, and which is very indeed modern images, if they could be put alongside with some other ethnographic images. So to what extent these two different discourses of the traditional orientalizing visual discourse is juxtaposed or entangled with this discourse of modernization in terms of photography. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you also for the link. I mean, I've seen it before, but I wasn't aware that it's actually digitized online. So it's really, really nice to see. Thanks. There were several things now. And again, my script is really terrible. So with the ethnographic photography, I have to again really refer to the comment by Harsha before, because this is something very different. But it really is a very important narrative that complements this, but it goes into a different direction. And this is also the question again of this photo as an autonomous object, the question of whether the ethnic photograph is used for orientalizing purposes, mostly commercial interest behind that, but it might as well strengthen national sentiments. It might again produce an imagery of imperial inclusion. So we have ethnographic types or ethnographic photos in very different frameworks, and it does not really say much of that one particular image in which narrative it is framed. And about the ethnographic exhibition, it is the very same with the 1867 exhibition, where the Caucasus is also quite poorly portrayed. I mean, despite this central cultural capital in Russian 19th century culture, it is, I mean, there were, I think, 13 mannequins from the Caucasus, which is quite in contrast also to this famed diversity of the region. They were not able to put in mannequins of an Ossetian, of Chechens, etc. So these exhibitions did not necessarily reflect the ambition to capture the ethnographic diversity of the region. Well, again, depending on whatever narrative framework one might have been wanting to pursue. But thanks again.
Any more questions? Okay. I think
Yeah. Oh, Bella?
Sure. It's a really very, very basic and general question. First of all, Dominik, thank you so much for this terrific presentation. It was really interesting. And so it's a very basic question, which is why I hesitated to ask, but I wondered whether you see any aspect of the story that you're telling affect photographic or other kinds of representational practices in the early Soviet period in the same region. I don't ask you for the period between what you're talking about and the beginning of the early Soviet period, but I'm just wondering, you know, if, for example, if any of the photographers you're looking at continue to work, right? Or I don't know if the time span really would work out. But anyway, that's my question. I guess my question is for like a kind of after story or a kind of afterword to the story that you tell here.
No, thank you. The problem with the question really is that I don't exactly know, but because very often the archives, the libraries, they are split in this pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary in Soviet times, and I just delve into all the materials I can get of pre-revolutionary Baku, for instance, and I don't take much of a look at the photos where they're saying, yeah, these are the photos from the Soviet era, please help yourself within that uncatalogued fonts. So, I mean, we know certain photographers that they were still practicing, yeah. Many did not, many did go into exile, for instance. And then again, yeah, I don't exactly know, and I really don't feel on top of saying what that I can see certain continuities or ruptures or anything like that, because I really don't take a look at the early Soviet photography. So I'd rather say I don't know rather than speculate here.
thank you so much, everyone, Dominik and Naomi, for the presentation and the discussion, and everybody who asked questions. Thank you. It was great to see all of you, and hopefully we will, and the timing is good, right? Because Dominik needs to
avoid the lockdown.
escape the curfew, yeah. So great. So we will see you hopefully in a week, actually. So thank you so much, everyone, again.